Well, we're joined now by the Home Affairs Minister, not hiding today, but sitting here in the studio. Minister, welcome back to Insiders.
Pleasure. Thanks, Annabelle.
Now, the opposition leader seems to be hinting pretty strongly there that you might be the culprit for leaking these classified Home Affairs Department documents to Simon Benson at the Australian back in February. Was it you or anyone in your office?
Well, I did know, but I think the point here is that Mr Albanese wants to talk about anything other than John Setka, or perhaps the joy that he might express at Bill Shorten being back on his front bench. So I think he wants to talk about anything but those issues, and I think it was nothing more than a red herring.
Right, that leak came out in the Australian right when the Medevac legislation was going through the Parliament. It was politically advantageous to you, and you were so unupset by its release that you declassified and circulated it a couple of days later. Where do you think that leak came from?
Well, Annabelle, they're matters for police or for the departments to investigate, and obviously this is the discussion point around whether departments should be referring matters to the federal police, and that was the case in relation to Annika Smethurst's piece, and these issues have been around for a long time, where there have been leaks from departments or from the Hill, whatever it might be. They're either investigated or there's not evidence to proceed. These matters have been around since there was sparring between journalists and members of Parliament. I think that's just the reality of it.
Do you understand that people might think it's a bit weird that AFP investigation is discontinued and yet Annika Smethurst's cookery bookshelf is raided and the ABC in Ultimo is tied up for the whole day with an AFP raid? Well,
I think, in terms of the ABC raid, I think there'd been a discussion between the AFP and the ABC lawyers for a long period of time. I think there was a stalemate, as I've seen publicly reported now, and the AFP made arrangements with the AFP to come in and to try and discover documents or evidence as part of their investigation. Now, the ABC has a right to defend its own interests, of course. The AFP has a statutory obligation to investigate matters referred to it, and they have equally a statutory obligation to do that independently. So it's independent of government, and that's how it is under a Liberal government, under a Labor government for a long period of time, and I think that's how it should continue.
Let's go to the Annika Smethurst story about the extension of powers for the Australian Signals Directorate. You said that story was inaccurate.
Yes.
It seems to be still kicking around as an idea in government. Do you support the ASD having powers to investigate domestically?
Well, I think there are 2 points here. One is that the raids and that aspect which we've dealt with. The second point is the accuracy of the article, and I made the point, I think at the time, that it wasn't accurate. Now,
but was the government considering extending powers, and is it considering extending powers for the ASD to practice domestically?
Well, if you look back to what I said at the time, we don't support spying on Australians. That was a complete nonsense. But where you've got a paedophile network that operates out of Manila, live streaming children being sexually abused, there might be the ability for an Australian agency to try and shut that server down. If that same server was operating in Fitzroy here in Melbourne, then there would be very limited capacity for us in certain circumstances where it was masked, where it was rerouted and all the rest of it, that we weren't able to shut that paedophile network down. Similarly, in relation to a cyber attack on our Australian banks, if people weren't able to tap and go and pay and conduct their business for 4 or 5 days if the system was out, I think people would probably by about the second or third hour, let alone day, be demanding what is the government going to do to put this back online. Now, at the moment, we don't have the sophistication or capacity to be able to mount a counter-attack or to be able to have the technical capacity to be able to deal with that. So I think
this expansion of powers has your support?
No, I don't. I think there needs to be a sensible discussion about whether or not we've got the ability to deal with threats that we face. You see the recent attack on the ANU, where thousands of people had their personal records compromised. The ANU has had a series of attacks now. They've had issues around IP, around all sorts of aspects of their business and the way in which they conduct their university teachings and management of those records. I think they're reasonable discussions to have in the 21st century. We saw an attack on the major political parties in the run-up to this election, a cyber attack. And I think this is a huge issue around cyber, which is only just starting for businesses and for small businesses, for people at home, kids online. This is a massive debate for us over, I think, the next decade and beyond.
Okay. Can I take you back to the the Medevac briefing, which was published as the legislation was going through the House in February. Now, that briefing warned that if the Medevac legislation passed, the boats would restart and the government would be unable to prevent the transfer of rapists, paedophiles and murderers. On the 14th of February, you told Ray Hadley that there was an Iranian accused of murder that you would be unable to prevent from coming to Australia. So 4 months later, can you tell us what happened to that accused murderer in Iran? Have any rapists, paedophiles or criminals been brought to Australia under that legislation?
Just to take a step back, just to deal with the issue, which is a very difficult one on Manus and Nauru. I want people off Manus and Nauru overnight, but I want to do it in a way that doesn't restart boats and kids drowning again at sea, etc. So in December 14, when I came into this portfolio, there were just under 2,000 people, including 135 children in detention or on Manus and Nauru. That number now has decreased significantly, so we've got to about just over 800 people across the two islands. Nobody is in detention. There are no kids on Nauru. I've got all of the children out of detention here in Australia as well. And we want to do that in a way, given that we know that in Sri Lanka at the moment, people are trying to put ventures together, that those boats don't restart. So under the Medevac bill, there was the ability, quite a broad power, and I understand Labor's reconsidering its position now, and that they would be open to suggestions about how that bill could be repealed or at the very least wound back.
How many people have been brought under the Medevac legislation?
Only just over 30.
Right.
And
any people that you're worried about? Any criminals?
Well, I think we'll wait and see what happens without sounding alarm bells, but what I'm saying is...
But you've mentioned this Iranian alleged murderer. You've created that apprehension, so...
Well, the fact is we've got people who are charged with serious offences on Manus, for example.
Well, I understand
sexual assault against children.
Have any of those people been brought here is what I'm asking.
Well, I don't know the answer to that question in terms of the concerns that we have about individuals.
How can you not know the answer to that question, though? You're very worried about it.
We don't bring anyone to our country where we can't mitigate the risk. Annabelle made that very clear.
Sure,
so there will be some people...
You wouldn't be able to stop any of these people.
And that remains the case with the Medevac bill, because we can be compelled under that law to bring people. Now, it was set up on the basis that people wouldn't be brought here if they needed medical attention. It was a complete nonsense. We've brought many hundreds of people that have required attention, and we've been able to reduce the numbers significantly off Manus and Nauru. So where we have a concern about somebody in circumstances where they must come to Australia, we do offset that risk, if you like, through all sorts of measures, and we provide support to that person to get healthy. And the idea is that they would return back to Manus or Nauru. We've got 531 people off Manus and Nauru to the United States. We've got a couple of hundred people who are still in the pipeline, and I hope that they can depart shortly, but I want to reduce the numbers down to zero on both islands. But I don't want to bring people here who pose a risk, particularly to children.
So you reopened Christmas Island in a move that cost the budget nearly $200 million, and you're planning to shut it down again. Was anyone ever brought to Christmas Island as a result of the Medevac legislation?
No, they weren't, because...
It's a lot of money to spend to accommodate no people.
I mean, there are $16 billion spent on Labor's failed border protection policies. I don't want to spend any money on Manus and Nauru. I don't want new boats arriving at sea either. So we've got to try and provide a balance. Now, there are some decisions you make where Christmas Island, for example, has been in hot contingency for a while, that if we get overwhelmed with boat arrivals, and it's the Liberal and Labor Party policy today, that if a new boat arrives, those people, including children, would go to Nauru.
Are the numbers on Manus and Nauru now such, particularly if you remove some more to America, that you could close them both and transfer all of them to Christmas Island, which you've just spent a huge amount of money reopening? Well,
there's a big difference between Christmas Island and Manus and Nauru, because obviously they're sovereign states in PNG and Nauru in their case, and Christmas Island is part of our country. So a very different proposition. And I can say to you that people smugglers are more sophisticated, I think, than Australians understand. They watch every word that we say, they package it up. There were people on boats wanting to come to Australia, believing that there was going to be a change of government at the election. That's the reality, and we're dealing now already, still this very day, with people smugglers who are trying to put people onto boats. I don't want that to happen. We brought in the last 12 months, or just before that, the biggest number of refugees than any time in the last 30 years. and we did it the right way. And we should be very proud of the fact that we've been able to bring people in, provide them with support around housing, education, health, etc. But we don't want people coming on boats because it's a very perilous journey.
Back to Manus. The little-known private security company Paladin scored a $423 million contract in 2017 to service the Manus facility without going to tender. The National Audit Office is currently examining that arrangement. That contract expires in 2 weeks at the end of June. Will it be renewed?
Well, it's an issue for the department. They've obviously got people on their panel. They've obviously got contracting arrangements, and they'll look at the history of those people that are applying. They'll look at the suitability for them to provide services, etc., and they'll make judgments based on that. But services need to be provided. As I said, I don't want to spend any money on Manus and Nauru. I don't want people there. I want them off as quickly as possible. But a cohort of Iranians, for example, who have been found not to be refugees, bearing in mind there are 65 million people in the world that would seek to come to a country like ours, they refuse to go back to Iran, even with assistance packages and the rest. They've been found not to be refugees, and Tehran will not issue travel documents for those people if they don't willingly return. Equally, they're saying that even if they have an offer to go to the United States, they won't take that offer. So I'm not pretending to you that these issues or these individual cases are easy to deal with.
On the Manus situation, the initial plan was that the PNG government would take control of those services, and Paladin was shoved in at the last minute when that fell over. Have you now put arrangements in place for PNG to take over those services so that we don't hang on to this company?
Well, again, the department will work with the PNG authorities. We've got to make sure that we're getting value for money.
But you must know if this is 2 weeks away, what the state of play is.
Well, the likely arrangement is that there will be a continuation, but I'm not going to comment when the department's in the process of contract discussions, negotiations, etc.
Are you happy with the look of that company being rolled over when there's such?
Annabelle, I don't want any money spent up there. I don't want any people there. But look, I was able to inherit this problem that Labor had created. I have never put a person on Manus or Nauru. I've got hundreds of people off, including all of the children. I want to bring an end to it as quickly as possible, but I need to do it in a way that doesn't see a boat arrive with 20 kids tomorrow that will go to Nauru, and they are not covered by the US transfer deal. Right,
well, let's turn to that transfer deal, because it was originally agreed, wasn't it, between Prime Minister Turnbull and President Obama?
To both men's credit, yes.
To cover 1,250 people from Nauru and Manus. There's about 500 that have gone so far.
There's 531 who have gone. There are about 295 that are in the pipelines where they've got approvals, but they haven't been uplifted yet.
And will we get to the 1,250, do you think?
I don't think we'll get to the 1,250 because there's been quite, over 300 that have been rejected by the United States for various reasons. And that's an issue for the US. They're a sovereign state. They'll make decisions about who they bring under their migration program. But for those people, I hope that all of them can take up that offer where it's made. There are about 95 people who have either withdrawn from consideration or rejected an offer, and that's a concern as well. So if we can get those 95 across the line, then we get closer to zero.
And how many have we taken in return with this deal?
Well, we've worked closely with the UN, we've worked closely with partners in our region, we've worked closely with the United States. For example, we took 12,000 people plus just under that one Syrian intake, but overall people out of Syria and Iraq, over almost 24 or 25,000 people. We've taken people
I know that there are associated schemes, but under that specific deal, I know of 2 people that we've taken. Are there any more?
Well, under the arrangement that we had with the United States, there were people coming this way. There were people coming from Nauru and Manus to the United States, and not people coming this way. So we have separate discussions with the United States, with the UN, about other special cases, looking at cases that might be very hard, intractable in some circumstances, and as a global participant in that migration model, will provide support. But in some of those cases,
the 2 Rwandan men that we know about are the only 2 to come this way.
Well, as we've said, as the Prime Minister said, we will have a look at individual cases, but we're not bringing anyone to our country, Annabelle, who poses a risk to our country. We'll take the advice of ASIO, the Australian Federal Police.
But to be absolutely clear, we don't have any others coming from America apart from those 2 that we know about.
We don't have plans to bring any others from America at this stage, but we'll look at discussions with the US, the UK, Canada, New Zealand are our closest partners. We work incredibly close with them on intelligence and law enforcement matters and migration matters as well. So into the future, we'll see what happens.
Can you reassure us about those two men? Because, I mean, you were talking about the danger of bringing alleged murderers over from Nauru and Manus, but when you were making those comments, you already knew that we'd brought these two guys who had confessed to the machete murder of Western tourists in Uganda. What reassurances do you have for the Australian public?
Well, I'm not sure all of those facts are correct. And I think you've got to look at all of the facts of individual cases. You've got to look at the historical perspective around the circumstances, what's happened in the intervening period. And that's a different situation from somebody who has just sexually assaulted a girl on Manus in the last 12 months. So we'll look at individual cases. AFP, ASIO, our international partners will inform the discussion properly. They'll take all of that information into consideration, and we base our decisions on that information, which is assessed and analysed as to whether or not there's a risk here. And we will not take somebody who we believe is a risk to the Australian people.
You can understand the alarm that was occasioned by those reports, though, can't you?
Well,
doesn't sound very reassuring.
Annabelle, look, people will look at different circumstances and they'll make their interpretations. What I'm saying is people who are experts in these areas have the full information available to them through Border Force, through intelligence holdings from the US, whatever it might be, analysis of individuals. They make a judgment, they inform us of their advice, and we act on the advice.
Do you know where these guys are living?
Well, I just don't have any information in relation to individual cases, as the government said for a long period of time, but we aren't bringing people in that are posing a risk here.
Just quickly on another front, sure. In Syria we have now, after the end of ISIS, we've got people languishing in refugee camps. Various Western countries are now starting to bring war orphans home. We've got the Sharif family who's still bailed up in a refugee camp there. Is the Australian government opposed to the idea of them coming home?
No, we're looking at individual cases and we'll have a look at the circumstances. We need to provide protection for Australian citizens, in particular infants or children, and we also need to be mindful of the fact that if we're bringing teenagers back, for example, who may have been listening to the propaganda rhetoric, having watched horrific circumstances, bodies being mutilated, whatever it might be, over a long period of time, what threat those individuals might pose to our country if they're returned. So we're looking at those individual cases. We're working with the International Red Cross, with the US, the UK, other partners, but we've got to be mindful of our own security here, but provide support. And if somebody is to return, then what support we can provide around them in terms of state family services, education, de-radicalisation programs, popping kids back into school, pretending nothing's happened is just not a reality. So they're complex cases. We'll look at them compassionately but realistically, and they are very, very dynamic cases.
All right, sounds like one to watch.
Thank you.
Minister, thanks very much for joining us today.
Annabelle.
Appreciate it.